Why Native Americans didn't stand a chance when Europeans began arriving in the Americas. Many historians later described what happened as an inevitable conquest. According to this story, European technology, weapons, and ambition made victory unavoidable. But the reality is far more complex. Indigenous civilizations across the Americas were not weak, primitive, or defenseless. Many were powerful societies with organized governments, strong economies, and large populations. Some cities were larger and more advanced than the ones Europeans came from, yet within just a few generations of contact, entire civilizations collapsed. To understand why Native Americans didn't stand a chance against European expansion, we must look beyond simple explanations like guns and steel. The real reasons were deeper, more complicated, and far more devastating. One of the most important factors was disease. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they brought with them illnesses that had evolved over thousands of years in the Old World. Diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus were common in Europe and Asia. People there had gradually developed partial immunity after centuries of exposure. In the Americas, however, these diseases had never existed before. Indigenous populations had no biological defenses against them. When the first outbreaks began, they spread like wildfire through communities that had no way to treat or stop them. Smallpox was particularly devastating. The virus caused fever, severe pain, and blistering rashes that often left victims permanently scarred or blind if they survived. But survival was rare among indigenous populations encountering the disease for the first time. Entire villages could be wiped out in a matter of weeks. Families lost parents, children, and elders simultaneously. The social structure of communities collapsed because leaders, healers, and knowledge keepers died at the same time. In some regions of the Americas, historians estimate that up to 90% of the population died within a century of first contact. These losses were not caused by warfare, but by microscopic pathogens that traveled silently with European explorers. Disease alone would have been enough to destabilize societies, but it was only one piece of the larger picture. European technology also played a role, though perhaps not in the way many people imagine. Europeans possessed steel swords, metal armor, and firearms, while most indigenous weapons were made from stone, wood, or bone. At first glance, this difference appears overwhelming. However, early firearms were slow, inaccurate, and unreliable. They took time to reload and were often less effective in battle than traditional weapons. The true advantage of European technology was not just the weapons themselves, but the systems behind them. European societies had developed complex systems for producing tools and weapons in large quantities. Ironworking allowed them to manufacture durable equipment that could be repaired and replaced quickly. In contrast, indigenous technologies were adapted to local environments and resources. They were highly effective within those contexts, but were not designed for large-scale industrial production. When long conflicts began, Europeans could continuously supply their armies with weapons, armor, and equipment arriving by ship from across the Atlantic. Indigenous societies did not have the same logistical networks. Another major advantage Europeans possessed was animals, particularly horses. Horses had existed in the Americas thousands of years earlier, but had gone extinct long before human civilizations developed. When Spanish explorers brought horses with them in the 16th century, they introduced a new form of mobility and warfare that indigenous societies had never encountered before. Cavalry units allowed European soldiers to move quickly across terrain and strike with speed and power that foot soldiers could not easily match. The psychological impact of horses was also significant during early encounters. Many indigenous people had never seen such animals before, and the sight of armored riders charging into battle could be terrifying. However, technology and animals alone do not fully explain the rapid expansion of European control. Another critical factor was division among indigenous groups themselves. The Americas were not a single, unified civilization, but a vast continent filled with hundreds of different nations, languages, and cultures. Some groups were allies, while others were long-standing rivals. When Europeans arrived, they often took advantage of these divisions by forming alliances with certain tribes against others. One of the most famous examples of this strategy occurred during the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire. Hernan Cortes arrived in Mexico with only a few hundred Spanish soldiers, far too few to defeat an empire that controlled millions of people. However, many smaller tribes in the region resented Aztec rule because they were forced to pay heavy tribute and participate in wars. Cortes convinced several of these groups to join his campaign against the Aztecs. With thousands of indigenous allies supporting him, his small force grew into a powerful army capable of challenging the empire. The conquest that followed was not simply a Spanish victory, but a complex civil war among indigenous societies. With Europeans manipulating the outcome, a similar pattern appeared across North America during later colonization. European settlers frequently played tribes against each other, offering weapons, trade goods, or protection in exchange for alliances. These alliances shifted over time, creating unstable political landscapes that weakened indigenous resistance. While native nations sometimes united to fight colonial expansion, maintaining long-term cooperation was extremely difficult across such vast territories and cultural differences. Another powerful advantage Europeans possessed was written communication. Indigenous societies relied primarily on oral traditions to preserve history, laws, and knowledge. These oral systems were incredibly rich and sophisticated, allowing stories and information to be passed down accurately across generations. However, written records allowed Europeans to store information, coordinate plans, and communicate across great distances in ways that oral systems could not easily replicate. Letters, maps, and documents allowed colonial governments to organize settlements, military operations, and trade networks more efficiently. Religion also played an important role in shaping European attitudes toward conquest. Many European explorers believed they had a divine mission to spread Christianity to new lands. This belief gave moral justification to expansion and colonization. Indigenous religions and spiritual practices were often dismissed as pagan or uncivilized. Missionaries attempted to convert native populations, sometimes peacefully, but often through coercion. Religious differences deepened cultural misunderstandings and contributed to the erosion of traditional, indigenous ways of life. Perhaps the most underestimated factor in European success was time. European expansion did not happen overnight. Colonization unfolded gradually over centuries. At first, European settlements were small and fragile. Many early colonies nearly collapsed due to starvation, disease, or conflict. In fact, several early attempts at colonization failed completely. But each generation of settlers brought more people, more supplies, and stronger political support from Europe. Over time, the balance of power shifted steadily in favor of the newcomers. Population growth became a decisive factor. Europe had tens of millions of people, and many were willing to migrate in search of land, wealth, or religious freedom. Ships carried waves of settlers across the Atlantic year after year. Even after suffering heavy losses from disease or conflict, colonies continued to grow. Meanwhile, indigenous populations were declining rapidly due to epidemics. The demographic imbalance grew larger with each passing decade. Land ownership was another critical difference between European and indigenous worldviews. In many native cultures, land was considered communal and sacred rather than private property. It could be used and shared but not permanently owned by individuals. Europeans, however, believed land could be claimed, bought, and sold. Signed treaties or made agreements with indigenous leaders, they often interpreted them as permanent transfers of ownership. Indigenous leaders frequently believed they were simply granting temporary usage rights. These misunderstandings created endless disputes that almost always favored European interpretations. Economic motivations also drove colonization forward. European empires competed fiercely for wealth and territory. Colonies provided valuable resources such as gold, silver, tobacco, sugar, and furs. These goods generated enormous profits for merchants and governments back in Europe. As the economic benefits became clear, colonization intensified. Investors funded expeditions, governments sponsored settlements, and private companies established trading networks across the Americas. Indigenous lands became part of a global economic system that prioritized profit over coexistence. Violence was never far from this process. When negotiations failed or resistance grew strong, colonial forces often responded with brutal military campaigns. Entire villages were destroyed, crops were burned, and survivors were forced to relocate. These strategies were designed not only to defeat enemies, but to discourage future resistance. Over time, repeated conflicts weakened indigenous societies, already struggling with disease and displacement. Despite these overwhelming challenges, it is important to recognize that indigenous peoples did not simply disappear. Many fought fiercely to defend their lands and cultures. Some formed powerful confederations that resisted European expansion for decades. Others adapted by learning new technologies, forming alliances, and negotiating with colonial governments. Indigenous resistance shaped the history of the Americas in countless ways, even if it did not ultimately stop colonization. Understanding why Native Americans did not stand a chance against European expansion requires looking at all these factors together. It was not a single advantage that determined the outcome, but a combination of disease, technology, alliances, economic power, and demographic change. European colonization was not inevitable, but once these forces began interacting, the balance of power shifted dramatically. The story of conquest is often told as a triumph of exploration and progress. But from another perspective, it is also a story of loss on an unimaginable scale. Languages disappeared. Cities were abandoned. Cultural traditions that had existed for thousands of years were disrupted or destroyed. Yet many indigenous cultures survived despite everything, preserving their identities and continuing their struggles for recognition and rights today. The consequences of these early encounters continue to shape the modern world. The borders of nations, the distribution of wealth, and the cultural landscape of the Americas were all influenced by the events of this period. By examining the true reasons behind the collapse of indigenous power, we gain a deeper understanding of how history unfolded and why its effects are still visible centuries later. In the next episode of this series, we will explore one of the most powerful forces behind the destruction of indigenous societies: disease. Long before armies conquered territories, invisible epidemics were already reshaping the Americas. Entire civilizations began collapsing. Before Europeans even arrived in large numbers, the next chapter reveals how these invisible killers changed the course of history forever.